sense that everyone's ideas are acceptable. Now, it's interesting. It's a very fraught and sometimes combative field, but everybody is brought into the field, and I think of someone in particular. Now, Harish Trivedi is a person who's criticised post-colonial theory for decades, and yet he is included as a post-colonial theorist. So it is a convivial and critical democracy that embraces a whole range of different approaches, different people. So when we're thinking about post-colonialism today, it's important to think about the impact it had on globalization, particularly globalization studies. The language of post-colonialism drove the cultural turn in globalization in the 1990s, and this has had a very profound effect. You see, globalization studies had been driven mainly by development studies, economics, sociology. But in the 90s, something very interesting happened, and as Hamish and Gandhi put it this way: they have at least two important things in common. They're concerned with explaining forms of social and cultural organisation whose ambition is to transcend the boundaries of the nation state. And they seek to provide new vistas for understanding cultural flows that can no longer be explained by a homogeneous Eurocentric narrative of development and social change. And so that narrative of development and social change has been, in a sense, overtaken by the humanities, overtaken particularly by literary visions of the future, literary visions of the potential of post-colonial societies. Now, from about the turn of this century, there has been a lot of talk about post-colonial futures. What is the future of the field? Where is it going? Some people said, what was post-colonialism? But nevertheless, it keeps going. And so there's a plethora of ideas about the future of post-colonial studies that arose. And the idea of the future is very, very important to the sense of its longevity. Now, there are some growing themes in post-colonial studies that I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but obviously the issue of transnational literatures, transculturalism, multiple modernities, world literature, cosmopolitanism, the post-colonial sacred, and post-colonial eco-criticism. Now, all these are fields that post-colonial critics, theorists are getting into, and they create a very vibrant, a very rich theoretical landscape. But I want to talk about the continuing relevance of post-colonial analysis. It's it's not locked in the 19th century colonialism of the British Empire. It's the empires of cultural, technological, and economic power, and their colonizing effects are now the subject of post-colonial analysis. So, as well as all those themes and topics that I mentioned before, the relevance of post-colonial analysis lies in the fact that it can address power. It can address what we can call imperial power, and it does that without being a theory of everything. It's not a theory of everything. It's a theory that's developed strategies to address the operation of economic and cultural power in the world today. Now, what I'm interested in explaining is, well, how am I developing post-colonial studies? These are only three aspects of the post-colonialism today, but they're ones that I'm developing, and I want to give some small time about them. Now, post-colonial utopianism is an interesting concept. You know, utopia is regarded by most people as a just pie in the sky, wishful thinking, a fantasy. But the Utopian Study Society was formed in 1988 and the Empire Rights Pact written in 1989. So these two things, post-colonial theory and utopianism, have a history. They have a history of coming into the fore at a very significant moment in history. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of Russia, of the USSR. And so this was a pivotal point. And the issue of utopianism is extremely important for post-colonial studies, but it really stems from this magisterial book by Ernst Bloch, The Principle of Hope. Now, it was written back in from 38 to 47, but since its translation into English in 1986, it's become an absolute foundational text. And that's joined with Frederick Jameson's Archaeologies of the Future. Now, the combination of Marxism and science fiction has driven utopian theory right through, I suppose, the latter part of the 20th century and into this century now. But utopia is important for several reasons. There's a difference between utopia and utopianism. And I think this is important for its relevance to post-colonial studies. There's a difference between the placeless place and the spirit of hope, between the representation of utopia and the anticipatory function of utopianism. So while utopia may be a fantasy, utopianism is, according to Ernst Bloch, about hope. Now, without hope, we cannot live. And so that issue of hope for the future, the vision of possibility, the vision of a different kind of future, is absolutely crucial to post-colonial writers whose drive to resist, whose drive to transform was founded in the vision of a future, a possible future. So Lyman Tower Sargent talks about utopianism as social dreaming, and certainly writers are absolutely crucial in dreaming about certain kinds of futures. Ruth Levitas says, utopia is about the desire for a better way of living, expressed in the description of a different kind of society that makes possible that alternative way of life. Now, that idea of a better way of living, a different kind of society, these underpin the drive, the belief in a different kind of world. And that belief is absolutely crucial to post-colonial writing, because post-colonial writing is not simply about writing back. It's not simply about resistance. It's about change. It's about the future. And that's why utopianism is so important. Now, an interesting thing about Utopia, Thomas More's book Utopia has almost a depiction of colonization. King Utopus invades the land, he changes its name, civilizes the indigenous inhabitants, and cultivates the natural wasteland. These are all stages of imperial control and colonization. So it's fascinating that post-colonial utopia is grounded in something that is, in its essence, imperialistic. Nevertheless, utopia and utopianism in particular are extremely important, because without a vision of change, change is impossible. And you cannot achieve anything that hasn't first been imagined. So what's really crucial for post-colonial writing is that the anticipatory function of literature. Now, Ernst Bloch had very great enthusiasm about art and literature, and he saw these as really key to the vision of the future. The importance in imaging a different world. Now, it doesn't mean to say that all art and literature are utopian in the sense that they are all about a possible world. But their very nature is one that enables them to imagine a different kind of world from the writers or the readers. Ian Ockery says writers are the dream mechanism of the human race. And that's right in the center of Ernst Bloch's vision of art and literature. Writers are the dream mechanism of the human race. And it's because writing, the anticipatory function of writing, enables readers to imagine a different kind of world. And Bloch calls this Vorschein, foreseeing, or anticipatory illumination. Art and literature have this Vorschein powerfully in practice. And anticipatory illumination is the revelation of the possibilities for rearranging social and political relations to produce Heimat, which is the German word for home, of course, but in Bloch, Heimat is has a lot more of meaning than that. It's the home we have all sensed, but never experienced or known. And he goes further to say it is Heimat as utopia that determines the truth content of a work of art. I don't want to unpick that, but it's a fascinating statement. Heimat, the home we've all sensed, but never experienced or known, is the utopia that determines the truth content of a work of art. I heard recently of one critic who said the most practical thing that we can do today is believe in utopia. That is, believe in the possibility of a different world. And out of that belief, change is possible. So for Bloch, Heimat always lies beyond the border. It lies beyond the nation state. It lies beyond the border of our social experience. And so that brings in the next important theme that I am pursuing, borders and bordering. You know, borders, of course, are critical in today's world. There is so much crossing of borders, fleeing, asylum seekers, refugees, and the response to that, the hysterical response of nations has been to close borders and to make it as hard as possible for people to move. So borders have become a critical issue in the world today. And they're an issue that I think lies close to the heart of post-colonial studies. So let me ask this question. What would the world look like without borders? Just take a minute to think about it. It'd be a very, very different world. What would happen to inequality, the differences in culture, and cultures learn to connect? The idea of a world without borders is utopian in essence. Now, the borders, of course, have grown greatly. At the end of World War II, there were 7 border walls. When the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls. But today, there are 77 border walls or fences. And of course, the most notorious is that unfinished border wall going up between the United States and Mexico, a border that will never be finished, I believe. But what is a border? Now, I've been talking about border walls, and we think of borders as physical boundaries, don't we? We think of borders as physical obstructions, such as walls and fences. But a border is not a thing, but a practice. And when we think about borders as being practices dynamic rather than static, it changes the way we understand the process of bordering. Borders are both a consequence and a production of power relationships. So the practice of bordering goes within as well as around and outside the state. So this is a border between Israel and Palestine. And what I like about it is that vision of possibility through the border wall, through the wall that's attempting to keep people hemmed in, locked in. There's a vision of a different kind of world. That's a pure utopianism. It's the idea of a different world can be possible beyond the borders, beyond the border wall. And I think that's where utopia and the border comes together, because that border is always subject to the vision of the artist and the writer. In this case, of course, it's an artist, but it depicts for me the essence of the utopian belief in a world beyond borders that are across the world today. Now, Cavafy's Waiting for the Barbarians, which is a poem on which J.M. Coetzee's novel Waiting for the Barbarians is based. It's a very interesting poem. It says, "Why this sudden restlessness and confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home so lost in thought. Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come." And some who have just returned from the border say, there are no barbarians any longer. Now, what will become of us without barbarians? They were, those people, a kind of solution. Now, it's interesting how powerful poetry can put us a truth. You know, the other, the barbarians, they're the ones who keep us assured of who we are. So the barbarians are a kind of solution, because being other, they can justify our borders and the bordering practices that create our own identity. And so borders, therefore, are always subject to dismantling by a vision of a different kind of future, a vision of possibility. So the borders are not just around the state, the borders proceed within. The boundary of the state never marks a real exterior. It is a line drawn internally within the network of institutional mechanisms through which a certain social and political order is maintained. Now that puts very beautifully the way in which bordering practices of the state are there to control the movement, the operation, and even the identity of citizens, people within the borders. And importantly, the boundary of the state is not just a real exterior, it's something that proceeds through the society. And a clearer example of that, Simonson comes up with 8 borders or boundary markers as criteria for national membership. Now you think both of us, I mean, both of us, all of us coming from different nations can see the truth of this. But these boundary markers are criteria for national membership: national ancestry, being of the national religion, birth on the country's soil, having lived in the country for most of one's life, language skills, respect for the country's laws and institutions, having host national citizenship, and feeling as part of the nation. Now, if you think about those, you'd say, well, yeah, that makes sense. The people who have those can claim to be national citizens, members of a nation. But of course, there's many people who have not all of these things. And this is the kind of crisis that we're facing today with borders, that the boundaries, the border practices that are going within the state are separating people from each other and are preventing an acceptance, are preventing a true acceptance of the other. So borders and the horizons of literature. In step across this line, Salman Rushdie says, good writing assumes a frontierless nation. Writers who serve frontiers have become border guards. In our deepest natures, we are frontier crossing beings. We know this. We know this by the stories we tell ourselves, for we are storytelling animals too. Now, you know, the memory of a nation is national history. But the memory of a people lies in stories. It lies in the stories that principally come from the creative imagination. And so the creative spirit for which literature is a powerful metonym is the ultimate border crosser. It's inherently post-national because its tendency is not to belong. The nationality of literatures being a function of reading rather than writing. Heimat is not the nation, but the horizon of possibility. You see, when people talk about, well, this or that literature is typical of that nation's literature, what they're doing is reading into it a national identity that the writer has not necessarily put there. And so national identity is, in literature, is very much a function of the institutions of reading. Criticism, universities, teaching, and it is through these that the idea of a national identity in literature arises. And of course, countries like Australia have had this very strongly imprinted on them because it's a young country and the idea of national identity has always been very important. But that national identity is purely a function of reading and not of the writing itself, because the writing, as Ernst Bloch puts it, is about anticipatory illumination. It's about being frontier crossing beings. And rather than border guards, we should embrace the potential of literature to cross borders. So ultimately, Heimat is not the nation, but the horizon of possibility. And so that brings us to the concept of the transnation. Now, the nation has been widely critiqued in by not just post-colonial theory, but by colonized people. There's a deep dissatisfaction with the concept of nation for good reasons. Wally Circus sees Africa as carved up like some demented tailor who paid no attention to the fabric, colour or pattern of the quilt he was patching together. And, you know, interestingly, no nation has shown or no national leader has shown any desire to refashion that quilt by redrawing the boundaries, the borders of the nation. So the nation is simply a colonial construction. And that has been the source of great criticism for a number of post-colonial critics. Now, J.A. Hobson, in his book, Imperialism, said, empire-bred nationalism undermined the chance of true internationalism. And empire-bred nationalism for him was both the nationalism that was a continuation of British settlement, as in the settler colonies, and also the nationalism that arose as resistance to empire. Empire-bred nationalism undermined the chance of true internationalism. And Partha Chatterjee makes the point that nationalism undermines the progress of decolonisation because the national form is hostile to these countries' own cultures. And yeah, Chatterjee is very interesting on these matters. And he says that while the Orientalist problematic is reversed, that is the problematic of the Oriental as passive and submissive, the Orientalist thematic, which is the set of philosophies, Enlightenment discourses of the West, these are not dealt with at all. So the idea of nationalism is something that can actually undermine the progress of decolonisation. Now, two people who really recognise this were Tagore and Gandhi. Tagore was very sort of vocal about the problems of nationalism, and Gandhi as well, who's possibly the greatest pure anarchist that the world has seen. And both of these were very critical of the nation and particularly of nationalism. Now the transnation comes out of this. Now the transnation is the fluid migrating outside of the state that begins within the nation. It's a way of talking about subjects who circulate around the bordering practices of the state. And if I might just reflect for a minute on this picture that I put in. I thought this is a particularly good example of the transnation, because what we find, that woven piece, of course, is what we call the nation, but the nation is made up of an incredible variety of different subjectivities and even subcultures and cultures. And so all those make the transnation. The transnation are those fibres which are not bound within the mythology of nation. So perhaps the best theory of this, of course, is Deleuze-Guattari's distinction between smooth and striated space. Striated space is the warp and woof of cloth, and that's the way the state works, with striations, with structures. But the transnation is the smooth space. Smooth space is like a felt, it's rolled, it's not, it has no real structure. The transnation is the smooth space that circulates around the striated space of the nation. And so the undramatic, as Scott coins the term, infrapolitics, the undramatic, everyday, mundane acts of quiet evasion, slowdowns, false compliance, feigned endurance and sabotage carried out by factory workers, that when performed by many, change or alter a landscape of power. Now, I hasten to add that the transnation is not necessarily insurgent. It's not necessarily directed at undermining the state. But the transnation is a constant threat to the state because it circulates around the striated structures of other states' control. And the creative spirit is the ultimate border crosser. The stories of the transnation, the memory, the cultural memory of the transnation lies in stories produced by literature, produced by writers, and the creative spirit is the ultimate border crosser. The creative spirit is so important to the transnation, just as it has been to post-colonial societies throughout the world. So the creative spirit is Ferenc Bloch, that which drives the utopian vision of possibility. The creative spirit is that which goes beyond the bordering practices of the state, which thinks outside them. And the creative spirit, by crossing that border, is the storytelling function of the transnation. So thank you very much for that, and we'll I'll take a few questions if you like.
Thank you, sir, for such an enriching and thought-provoking, at the same time inspiring lecture.
Yeah, I'll just okay, stop sharing. Right.
And as usual, you have innumerable numbers of fan following, as we were discussing with ma'am when I visited Ahmedabad. And ma'am was telling that it is first in India when she came along with you, she understood that what you have written. So it's absolutely, I remember those words buzzing because I had a long interaction with her there when you were busy, signing your book copies.
Right. Well, are you going to field these questions, or I see there's a lot of questions.
No, I'll volunteer, sir. This question is pertaining to your book.
Right.
Now, most of us who has been reading your works for around in my case more than a decade, in others' case more than 2 decades, you have had a very considerable interest in the notion of transformation. Now, how does this notion of transformation feed into your new book, the newest that you have released soon in the recent past, that is Utopianism in Post-Colonial Literatures?
Yeah. Transformation is a critical thing, and the important thing to remember is that we think of transformation as something that happens to us. Post-colonial transformation is about the act of transforming the discourses and technologies of power. Now, the model for that is the way in which the English language was taken. It was molded to suit the culture of the writers, and it was changed. And in that change, in transforming the language, writers could say, I'm writing your language so that you can understand me, but because of the difference in my writing, I have a world that you can't share. So that transformation of language became the fundamental model for the transformation of power, transformation of the technologies of power. And that's the point at which post-colonial theory develops strategies that can address the power structures of the contemporary world. It shows that the agency of ordinary writers, ordinary subjects, is there in the capacity to change the landscape of power.
Thank you, sir.
So, yes.
If I can request you to stop the PPT, sir, if possible.
Sorry?
The PowerPoint. Have you stopped, sir?
You're breaking up. I'm not hearing terribly well.
Sir, your PowerPoint, have you stopped, sir, at your end?
Have I stopped?
Have you stopped the PowerPoint at your end, sir?
Oh, the PowerPoint? Yeah. Do you want to
The
see the
screen sharing.
PowerPoint?
No, sir. We want. I just want to ask you if PowerPoint is over, you can just stop sharing the screen.
Yeah.
We want to see you on the full screen.
Okay. Do you want me to put the PowerPoint up again?
No, no. We want to put you. Want to see you. So if you can stop the PowerPoint.
I've closed. All right. Hang on. Oh.
Share screen.
All right. I don't know what I did there. Okay. All right. I'm trying to. All right. When you share screen. Yeah. All right. Okay. Is that better?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right.
Could you comment on the perceived spiritual turn in post-colonial reading, where
Yes.
there is a reimagination, revival of sacred as a form of resistance, especially in Indian context?
So you're breaking up, and I'm not understanding terribly well. But are you saying how is transformation operate as a form of resistance?
Yes, yes, sir.
Well, a very interesting moment occurred to me in a conference, and that was a Dalit woman stood up and said, "You have given us a language. You have given us a language with which we can speak back to power, with which we, as Ed would say, speak truth to power." And I found that very moving because it addresses another issue, and that is that post-colonial theory is dominated by people from the West. Well, in our case, the Empire Rights Pact was written in Australia, which is a very interesting situation of being both colonized and colonizing. And so I think that has been a way in which the idea of transformation can operate in India. But of course, India has been absolutely crucial in producing texts that have transformed the landscape of English literature. India in particular, but also South Asia in general, have transformed what we understand as English literature. And so it has been extremely powerful and on a global stage in that way. As far as in the internal operations of bordering practices in India, I would say that the same kinds of principles operate, that the writers and artists have the capacity to envisage a different form of, a different kind of future, a different possible world. And, it's tough when you get certain forms of populism and nationalism operating at government level. But nevertheless, this is where the creative spirit has the potential to change the landscape of power by encouraging people to believe that change is possible, that a different world is possible. And once people believe that, then a different world will come about.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, should we consider that border is a physical entity and bordering stands for abstract and mental process of meaning creations?
Is that one written down? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, once you understand that borders are not simply fences and walls, that borders are a practice, then it helps you to see the ways in which subjects are hemmed in a society. And it also shows you ways in which those borders can be crossed. And I think that it's very important to understand that borders are not simply fences or walls. Borders operate within the society in ways I've mentioned with Simonson's categories of national membership. These are borders. These are borders that control the way people think of themselves, you know. And once we get a movement of the imagination through creative writing, those borders can be crossed. And yeah, and so, you know, I'm a great believer, along with Ernst Bloch, on the anticipatory function of art and literature. And I believe that as far as India is concerned, Indian literature has changed the way in which the world sees India, and has given it agency, has given, you know, given it a capacity to change English literature itself, which I think is absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you, sir. And the next question is, discourse is a border. So is creative discourse an attempt to deborder?
Now that is an interesting question. A discourse is not simply talking, as we know. We take Foucault's sense. It's a set of rules by which the world comes into being. But when I talk about creativity, I'm not talking about creative discourse as such. I'm just talking about the operation of creative language, creative imagery, and the operation of the creative spirit. So it's an interesting thing. And when you think about it, the idea of creative discourse can reintroduce certain kinds of borders, you know. For instance, there are certain kinds of genre borders that, you know, certain things are regarded as novels or poetry and other things are not. And so I think, yeah, I think creativity must cling to that capacity to overcome the borders, even the borders of discourse, if you know, creative discourse is a thing. I would say creative discourse is discourse about creativity, but yeah.
We take the last question of the day.
Yeah.
When you talk of utopianism, it spontaneously alludes to Friedrich Engel's famous critique or utopian socialism in his work, Socialism, Scientific and Utopian.
Yeah.
Marxism also talks of a dream of a better world. That dream, they claim, is not only achievable through praxis, but also a historical inevitability.
Yeah.
The Marxists are internationalists too.
Yeah.
Now, given these, how do you explain the ideological bearing of your version of post-coloniality vis-a-vis Marxism?
Well, you know, this is a very interesting question, because Ernst Bloch was a Marxist, and Marx himself was not very fond of the concept of utopia. But the Marxist utopianisms, such as you know, various kinds of critics today, particularly Frederick Jameson, see that Marxism and utopia really go hand in hand, not as a vague wish fulfillment, but as a vision of a possible world. So in terms of utopianism, this, my view of utopianism, of post-colonial utopianism, you know, intersects very strongly with Marx's belief in a different world. Now, Marx saw that this different world was inevitable, But I think it requires action. It requires action, and particularly action from creative thinkers. And so that's where my vision would distinguish itself from Marx's. I don't see, utopia as inevitable. I do believe that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King said. It might bend toward justice, but justice is not of itself inevitable. So utopian thinking is a vision of a different kind of future that requires an act of the creative spirit. And so that's, given the strongest utopian thinkers today are Marxists. But nevertheless, I think that the idea of an inevitable transformation needs to be rethought.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a engaging and interesting set of questions put across to you, and you answering them so critically as you always do. Now I will ask my host Priyanka to take over.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. May I now request our respected Director of Humanities and Social Sciences of Assam Don Bosco University, Dr. Riju Sharma, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay.
Riju ma'am, over to you.
Riju ma'am, are we audible?
Kindly unmute yourself, Dr. Riju. Ma'am, are we audible? I guess there is some technical problem.
Okay, so I think there's some technical issue. So on behalf of Riju ma'am and School of Humanities and Social Sciences, I take this opportunity to thank our honorable speaker, Professor Bill Ashcroft. Sir, on behalf of Don Bosco University, School of Humanities and Department of English, it was an absolute honor and pleasure to have you, sir, today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you for having an interaction with our budding BA, MA, and PhD students. I'm sure this will be a completely unforgettable experience for all our students, including all of us. We are here. I was fortunate to meet you physically, and definitely we will be, expecting after this pandemic is over to have you someday at our beautiful university campus in Tapasya Garden, Sonapur, Guwahati. On behalf of Assam Don Bosco University, sir, and Department of English, sir, we thank you so much, and it was an absolute pleasure, sir. Please take very good care of yourself and ma'am,
Okay.
sir.
I will.
Thank you so much for coming, sir. Thank you very much. Please take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hospitality. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, participants, for joining. Thank you, Father Stephen, for joining us. And thank you, all of you. Thank you for joining. Please take good care. This is Shoykot Banerjee signing off for now.